Good morning, friends. It is good to be in the room with you here together today. It's very different when it's an empty room. And if you're joining online, welcome to. So glad that you're here. You look better here than you do in your pajamas. There's a table that usually emerges like magically in the seconds before I walk up that, hey, there we go. Thank you so much. So it's sort of like we're getting New Year's all over again, isn't it? It's kind of like the New Year 2.0. So if your 2026 didn't quite start the way you wanted it to the first time, we get another swing at it today. So welcome back. So good to be here with you. We're going to be wrapping up this series that we've been in. I'm looking forward to that and also looking ahead to what's coming. So it's a good time to be engaged. It's a good time to be here. So glad that you're here with us together today. Before we dive into the series for today, just want to remind you one more time, next Sunday we have a baptism scheduled here in this service. Several folks coming forward to be baptized. And if you have put your faith and trust in Jesus at some point, whether recently or some time ago, but you haven't yet taken the step of baptism, I started to say being baptized, and baptism comes out different. Being baptismed, I want to encourage you, take that opportunity. It's not too late to sign up. You can go to our website. There's a button right on the home page where you can take part in that. Next Sunday, we're going to celebrate baptism together. Also, in 2 weeks, we're going to be shifting to our next series for the year. This is really like part 2 of what we began with the series that we're in. We've been calling this The Calling. And if you've been with us, you know that we're really going at individual discipleship, like daily drills that we can do individually to hear and follow the call that Jesus has for us. In a couple of weeks, we're going to shift. We're going to continue studying Luke, but we're going to expand it out to consider the calling that we have collectively as a church, as Christians collectively, to go and be the hands and feet of Jesus. We're calling this series For God and Neighbor, and this is really the impetus behind everything that drives what we do. We're called to bring the love of Jesus, the healing, connection, purpose that he wants to show and flow through us, and we do it, 1, for God, and 2, for love of neighbor. This is the core command. We actually saw it just a few weeks ago in our calling series. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And this is not just an individual call, but it's a collective call as well. So we're going to see some collective application in this series. I'm looking forward to that. It also coincides with the final month of our 2-year vision campaign. If you've been with us for that long, then you know that a couple of years ago we launched what we're calling the 4 Lake Norman Project. And it's a 2-year initiative to fund some investments in our ministries, in our campus, in our outreach, in everything that we're doing to align around this mission and vision to bring healing, connection, and purpose to people all around Lake Norman through the love of Jesus. And so we've seen a lot of things happen over the course of this 2 years. A lot of new ministry initiatives, a lot of new growth and expansion of ways that we're able to see people experiencing healing, connection, and purpose. A lot of cool stuff has happened. And we are about 90% of the way toward our funding goals to be able to do all the things that God is calling us to do. And so with this series, For God and Neighbor, we're going to be challenged to close that gap, the final 10%, and then lead into this next season of ministry fully funded to do the things that God is calling us to for the next generation. And we're going to talk fundamentally about why we do this. Why do we want to invest in the next generation in and around Lake Norman? But we do it for God and his kingdom, and we do it for love of neighbors. So I'm excited for this series. I hope you'll join us throughout that series and hear this call together as we want to follow after Jesus, not only individually, but collectively as a church as well. So these last couple weeks, today and next week, are the final 2 weeks in our calling series. And really what we've been doing is we've been putting together kind of a framework around Jesus' training program for his disciples. So we started off in Luke, toward the end of Luke chapter 9 and into Luke chapter 10, and we saw Jesus' call to go. Like, of all the things that he calls us to do, he leads it off with to go and be peacemakers. We saw this call to go and bring peace to the people around us. He followed that up with a call to love. We love God, we love our neighbor by serving others, by learning from Jesus, by depending on God. Jesus gave us the call to choose. He said, you got to choose whether you're with me, helping gather people into the kingdom, or whether you're against me, scattering people away from his kingdom. Then we saw the call to watch. Jesus gives us some things to watch out for. Watch out for hypocrisy, caring so much about what other people think that we kind of form and shape-shift in the different places that we go. Watch out for hypocrisy. Watch out for greed, worry, complacency. Last week we saw the call to think, specifically the call to think for ourselves about the times that we live in and the call on our lives. So how Jesus said to think now, think big, think last. So a lot of ways that Jesus wants to train us in how to think about being his followers, about being children of God. And he actually had a lot to say about how to think. And that's our podcast for the week because I couldn't get them all in last week. And there's a big section of Luke 14 where we're going to be today where Jesus is continuing to give examples of how to think. And it really kind of follows on the framework that we talked about last week. If you missed any of those, they're all online. Even the last 2 weeks when we didn't meet in person, you can catch up on this framework together. I think it's important for us to see how this all hangs together. But we had a little fun on the podcast this week, and it's going to drop on Tuesday. I invite you to listen to the 4LKN, the 4 Lake Norman podcast. I gave Tucker a quiz on how to think. So it was a 4-question pop quiz. I didn't give him the answers ahead of time. And he got a 2.5 out of 4. So my challenge to you is see if you can beat Tucker's score. If you want to listen in on the podcast, download it. It's linkable in our Tuesday email. Or if you go to YouTube, just search Lake Norman Baptist. All the stuff is there. You can find that. Or it's also on Spotify. I listen to it in the car on Spotify. So find it wherever you want, but just encourage you to listen to the podcast. It's more on how to think from Luke 14 and kind of see how you do, at least based on the way I'm thinking about things. Today, I'm going to talk about one more call from Jesus, and it's the call to plan. The call to plan. Now, for some of you, when I say that, you just got excited. You're like, yes, I like to plan. Who are our planners in the room? We got some planners here? Oh, yeah. Planners are proud. Like, you pop your hand right up. You're like, yep, that's me. You're looking at your spouse next to you. You're like, yeah, you know that. I'm a planner. See, it's validated. Jesus valued planning. We're going to find that out today. So if you're a planner, this is going to be like candy today. Turns out Jesus values planning. But then there are others of us of a different stripe. We're the wingers, you know. We don't plan it, we wing it. Anybody brave enough to say, you know what, hey, that's me. Oh, yeah, we got some brave wingers at the 10:30 service. The 9 o'clock, they were more bashful about their winging it. But some of us plan, some of us wing it. So if you're a winger, this is going to be helpful today. I'm going to give you some things to actually grow and work on that muscle of a little bit of planning. It's the call to plan. And then next week, I got one more. I won't tell you until next week, but we got one more installment on this framework together, and then we're going to move on to for God and neighbor. So what does Jesus have to say about how to plan? How to plan. 4 things we're going to see in Luke 14, verses 25 through 35. And the first one is this. First thing I think Jesus wants us to know about planning is we need to know what we're planning for. Like before you get about thinking about planning, and you know this, right? If you're going to make a plan for something, well, what are we planning for? Are we talking about a vacation? That's going to dictate kind of what we're planning for. Are we planning for a project around the house? Well, we're going to plan differently for that than we would. So what are we planning for when we are making the kinds of plans that Jesus is going to call us to today? Now, brace yourself because Jesus is bold. Jesus is bolder than I am. So if something stings, do y'all know the Zach Williams song? If you miss the old me, it's Jesus' fault. It's a good one. So you can look that one up. That's a freebie. That's not in my sermon notes. But if something steps on your toes, it's Jesus' fault. So here it is. Luke 14, 25, he begins this. Know what you're planning for. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple." See what I mean? "And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." So today we're going to talk about making a plan for our lives as followers of Jesus. And we need to know what that means. And here in this opening section, Jesus gives us two prerequisites, two things that we need to know to be planning for. And the first one, he comes swinging right out of the gate, doesn't he? Like, hey, if anybody wants to be my follower and you don't hate your father and mother, your wife or your children, your brothers and sisters, then you cannot be my disciple. Well, that'll get your attention, won't it? He's actually been setting us up for this. If you were with us a couple weeks ago, he talked about the division that he came to bring. He gave this story that, hey, in families, the responses to me are going to differ. And sometimes in a family of 5, you got 2 against 3 and 3 against 2, mother against daughter, mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, father against son. And he gives specific examples of the division that actually comes in our homes and in our families. And many of us experience that. You're like, yeah, that's not hypothetical. Like, that's happening in my family right now. And if it is, I want you to be encouraged. Jesus gets it. Like, Jesus knew this would be the case. And he's got some helpful teaching for us in this. He also says, if you don't hate your own life, then you cannot be my disciple. And he's been talking about that as well. We talked about the call to watch out for worry. And the way he framed it there was say, hey, watch out for worry. Don't be so concerned about your life, what you're going to eat, what you're going to drink, because life is more than those things. Life is more than what we can store up and accumulate around us. And he uses this strong language of hate. Now, we've seen before, Jesus is not afraid to use hyperbole to get our attention. Is he saying, like, literally hate your family members? No, I think we can see that that's not what he means. Jesus is the one who said, love your enemies, love your neighbor as yourself. We're to love the people around us. But this is language of comparative loyalty. And I think we can see pretty easily what Jesus is saying is like, look, if you're more loyal to some person in your life than you are to me, well, then when those two directions diverge, you're going to have a choice to make. Like, you can't go both ways. And he says, if you're more consumed with building your own kingdom than with my kingdom, well, then you're not going to be able to follow me either. So it's a pretty practical teaching that Jesus is saying, but I think it goes deeper than that, because this language of hate actually harkens back to something we hear that's also pretty startling from the Old Testament. God spoke through the prophet Malachi about the way that his promise unfolded in the history of Israel. And he said, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I hated. If you know the story, there's Abraham, who God made all the promises to, that he was going to bring blessing to all the earth through Abraham's descendants. And then his son Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau, and they were twins. And Jacob was the one that God continued that Abrahamic promise through, the promise to bring salvation to the world. But Esau was not chosen to carry that promise. And the way that God framed that through the prophet Malachi was, I loved Jacob and I have hated Esau. Now, does that mean that God had it out for this guy? Like he was just had his thumb on him, keeping him down and kicking him while he was down? No, actually not at all. Because what we see in the story of Israel is God actually took care of Esau. He cared for Esau. Esau's people became the Edomites, and God actually gave the Edomites a portion of inheritance, a land for them to live in. Jesus taught the Israelites, hey, don't go picking fights, don't go waging war against the Edomites because they're your kin, like they're related to you. And so we see in the story of the Old Testament how God actually protected and cared for Esau and his people. But where the shift comes is that when Esau's people, the Edomites, became consistently wicked, consistently evil, consistently rebelling against God, God released them to go their own way, to follow their own path. But Jacob, the line that he had promised to bring salvation through, when they turned evil, when they did wicked things, which they did, God in his grace redeemed Jacob. Both of them had done evil and wickedness. Their people actually had done evil, wicked things. But one he released to their own devices, and one he redeemed. I want to talk to Christians for a second who are living in that space of a divided home, and you're feeling the pain of family members, friends, loved ones who are going a different path. Like there's division in your home. How do you handle that? How would Jesus have you handle that relationship? And I think what we can see from God's relationship between Jacob and Esau is, as much as we want to redeem the people that we love, sometimes our calling is to release those people. Because God is the only one who can do the redeeming. Now, does that release mean that we turn against them and we stab them in the back and we throw them under the bus and we have nothing to do with them? No, not at all. God cared for Esau. He provided for him. He protected him. But ultimately, when they were bent on going their own way, he released them. But God is the one who also can redeem. So if you're living with that tension and that heartache in your own home, my encouragement to you is pray that God would do the redeeming. I think we get so wound up in trying to be the redeemer for our loved ones when God calls us to release them. Because it can wreck our own following. It can wreck our own calling when we see ourselves as the redeemer. I also want to talk for a second. If you're the person who's kind of going the other way, like maybe you're in the room or you're watching online because you've got a loved one who has kind of talked you into being here. Maybe they've been talking you into being here for a long time, but you're not really in. Like, you know, deep down in your spirit, like you haven't really become a follower of Jesus. I want to speak to you for a second as well. Because one of the reasons Jesus points to that we go away from Jesus is we get so tied up in the relationships that we have here that we walk away from Jesus in order to make peace with somebody that we want to be connected to here, whether it's a friend or a friend group or a set of work colleagues. So if you're walking away from Jesus because you're prioritizing other relationships here on earth, whatever they are, I want you to consider, think for yourself about those choices. Consider the choices that you're making, because it's your life that's at stake. Not your parents' life, not your siblings' life, not your spouse's life, not your friends' or other family members' life. It's yours. So consider the choices that you're making when we're in this situation of a divided home. So this is one reality that Jesus points to. And sometimes we need to release people and pray for God to do the redeeming. There's a second facet that we need to plan for, that we need to be prepared for when we're thinking about following Jesus and hearing his calling, and that is this. He says, if you do not carry your cross and follow me, then you cannot be my disciple. Well, what does that mean? Well, Jesus carried a cross. Jesus' cross was to suffer and die for the sins of the world. And so he says those who would hear his call and follow him also have a cross to carry. So what is the cross that you and I are called to bear? Well, the cross is a symbol of death. And I think that means there are certain things that you and I need to die to. Certain idols that we worship that we need to set aside if we're going to be a follower of Jesus, if we're going to carry our cross. One of my favorite pastors and writers is Pete Scazzaro. I've referenced him numerous times in the past. He actually points to 4 things that we need to die to in order to follow the crucified Jesus instead of the Americanized Jesus. And he talks about the Americanized Jesus as this idea that if I follow after Jesus, he's going to make me happy and healthy and everything's going to go well and I'm going to get the American dream if I follow after Jesus. And he says that's not really what it means to follow Jesus. And he points to 4 things we need to die to, 4 things that the world pulls us toward, 4 things that we naturally want. But to follow Jesus means we need to go a different direction. The first is the idol of being popular. The world says live to be popular, to be liked and well regarded by those around us. Jesus says watch out for hypocrisy, meaning we live so much for popularity that we're disingenuous, that we fake it for people to think we're one thing even though we're really something else. And so Jesus says don't let your desire for popularity turn you into a hypocrite. Second thing, the idol of being great. We need to die to this pull always to be first. Because Jesus says the first will be last. And it's this idea that when we pursue greatness and always run to the front of the line, and when we live to be as significant as possible, that's something we also need to die to. That's not what Jesus came to be and to do. Third thing, the pull to be successful. If you're following Jesus in hopes that he's going to make you successful, Jesus says you need to think again. Because Jesus says you can gain the whole world and lose your soul. You can gain everything the world has to offer and lose your own soul. So we need to die to success at all costs. And then the fourth thing is avoiding suffering. Some of us think that if we follow Jesus, then he's going to make all the pain go away. And it's all going to be okay, and life's going to be easier. Well, that's not a promise Jesus ever made. And in fact, do you remember? It's not in Luke's gospel. I think it's in Matthew and Mark, where Jesus is telling his disciples about his suffering and death. And he says to them, hey, I'm going to suffer and I'm going to die. And there was a time where Peter, the leader of the disciples, actually came to Jesus. And after Jesus had told him about his suffering, he was like, Jesus, don't talk like that. Like, you're not going to suffer and die. You're going to bring the kingdom. You're going to overthrow Rome. Like, what are you talking about, Jesus? You remember how Jesus responded to Peter? He said, get behind me, Satan. Like, that's the opposite of what he's calling. Jesus didn't avoid suffering. No, it's through his suffering that he brought eternal life. Jesus knows that on the other side of suffering is where real life is. So if we're going to follow the crucified Jesus, if we're going to carry our cross and follow him like he's calling us to, then that's what we need to plan for. We need to plan for turning from some of these things that are most natural to us and that get reinforced all the time by the world around us, even in Christian thinking sometimes, and get real clear on what it means to carry our cross and follow the crucified Jesus. Not the Americanized Jesus, not the world's Jesus. We need to know what we're planning for. So that's the first thing I think we need to nail down when we're hearing Jesus' call to plan. And then secondly, all right, if we know what we're planning for, I think he's telling us in this next section, before you start following Jesus, plan for the cost to finish. Before you start, make sure you know what it's going to take to finish. And this is how he makes this point. He tells a story. He says, suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, this person began to build and wasn't able to finish. So here's the story, and this would have been a common thing in Jesus' day. A landowner might build a watchtower, and it would add to the security of their property. It would add to the value of their property. But he says, before you get started on that project, which everybody's going to see, by the way, the wise planner is going to sit down and consider the cost to finish it. Because there's nothing more embarrassing than having that half-finished project, and then everybody knows you didn't count the cost before you got started. And it's not hard to see what Jesus is saying spiritually to us. He's saying, count the cost of following me. Before you get started, don't enter into this lightly. Becoming a Christian, becoming a follower of Jesus is an open invitation to anyone who will come to him, but it has a cost. And Jesus wants to be very upfront with that cost. He wasn't like a sneaky salesman that was like, hey, let me get you in and then tell you what it's going to cost. No, he was right up front. He said, you need to know what it's going to cost before you start. That's wise planning. I've shared stories before about the first house that Dina and I bought. It was a 100-year-old house, and we set out to renovate it from top to bottom, inside and out, and we did not do a very good job of counting the cost ahead of time, like of sitting down and estimating what we were going to get into. And so as a consequence, we spent 6 years in a construction site. Like, This was unfinished. That was unfinished. We'd pack up our bedroom and move to the living room and move to the dining room. And for 6 years, this is how we lived. We were birthing babies and raising kids in the chaos. I got pictures of like my oldest as a toddler, like standing there in his diaper, and there's like insulation hanging out of the half-finished wall. It was terrible. It was an ocean nightmare. But we survived. We had that house for 11 years, and I thought we were going to be stuck with it forever. We finally were able to sell that house after we paid contractors to come in and do the things that we did wrong the first time around. We did not count the cost very well, and we paid the price for a long time with that house. God's mercy, we finally sold it and cut ties with that. But you want a plan, right? Jesus says, don't go into this lightly. I think there's 3 elements, just practically speaking, that we can apply in our lives to help us make a spiritual plan. And this is going to be super practical. And just before we get into it, I want to let you know, this is I'm not drawing chapter and verse on this. This is just me processing and thinking through, all right, what would it look like to actually lay down some concrete plans for what it's going to cost to follow Jesus for the long haul? So if we're going to plan well, the first thing we need to create is a budget. Like, you planners know that. You're like, yep, spot on. You got to plan a budget if you're going to think about how much it's going to cost, right? And so what is a budget? Well, we're setting aside time and energy for what it's going to take to stick with our faith for the long haul. And we've seen a similar question like this raised earlier. In Luke 10, someone came to Jesus and asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And it's really a different form of the same question. He's like, what do I have to do in order to make it to the end and receive eternal life when I die? Will I go to heaven? What do I need to do, Jesus? And so I think this is a very similar kind of question. Well, Jesus answered that question by saying, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. All right, how do you do that? Jesus says, well, it looks like serving others, like the Good Samaritan. It looks like learning from Jesus, Mary and Martha. It looks like depending on God. So when we serve, when we learn, when we depend, these are all things that we do that we need to set aside time for, to invest in. These are ways of following Jesus. A good way to think about kind of who we are collectively and the resources that we have to invest is to think about our time, our talent, and our treasure. Like, how much time do we need to invest? How much of our talent and our skills do we need to invest? How much of our treasure, our monetary resources do we need to invest? And I think here's the key question that we all need to wrestle with before we start out following Jesus. Or if we've been following Jesus for a minute, we need to sort of back up and recalibrate. Here's the key question I think we need to ask. How much time, talent, and treasure do you need to give towards serving others, learning from Jesus, and depending on God in order to be invested for life? Because we all know the amount we invest in something to a large degree determines how much we stick with it, right? So if you lay down a small security deposit for a vacation home or whatever, and it's not much, it's easy to walk away from, right? You lay down a big security deposit and you're going to lose a big chunk, well, you're going on that vacation. You're not going to let that one pass, right? If you've invested a lot in your home, you're probably going to stick with it for a little while, or in a car, or in a hobby, or in a relationship. The more invested we are, the more we're going to stick with the plans that we have made, right? This is just true of us. And so, how much investment do we need to make in our spiritual life in order to stick with it for the long haul? Because let's be honest, if we make just a little bit of investment, we turn and go away, we didn't lost that much. But when we're meaningfully invested, like this is our life, this is what we're putting our time, talent, and treasure in, well, that's gonna have some sticking power for us. And that's gonna help us stay with this commitment to follow Jesus for a lifetime. So how much? What's the budget that we need to set? Well, on this, I think the principle of the tithe from the Old Testament is really helpful for us. So Jesus God's instruction to the children of God of Israel was to bring a tithe of all of their resources. So they were harvesting their wheat. They would bring 10% of their income of wheat and give that. That tithe would be the way to depend on God. And I think this 10% principle actually works really well across time and talent and treasure. So let's think about our time for a minute. If we need to invest time learning from Jesus, how much do we need to invest? And I got to thinking about this and think about how much time we invest in work. Well, the typical work week, 40 hours a week. I know a lot of us work more than that. Some work less than that. If you're a homemaker, you work like 140 hours a week. If you're retired, you remember what you used to work in a week. So, we're not all in the same place. But if you just take, for the sake of argument, that 40-hour work week and you go, all right, this is how much I'm investing every week in work. What if I tithed on my work time by investing 10% of that time in learning from Jesus? So what might that be? All right, well, you're here right now. Good for you. You're going to be here for a little over an hour, 65, 75 minutes. Okay, that's about I'll give you an hour 15 for that. If you did a Bible study, maybe this morning, or you're a part of a community group or something, and you do that every other Tuesday night, well, that's an hour and a half, 2 hours where you're showing up to learn from Jesus in the context of learning from others. All right, now you're getting to 2.5, 3 hours a week. And if you just read your Bible for 10 minutes a day and pray for 10 minutes a day, pretty quickly you're up to about 4 hours a week of learning from Jesus. And I think the principle of the tithe is that can be a transformative investment. God's going to take that 10% and he's going to transform the other 90% of our time. So how much does it take? I think that's a pretty good principle, a pretty good benchmark to think about. If we take 10% of our work time and we devote that to learning from Jesus. All right, what about serving others? All right, think about the personal time that you have during a week. The time where you're doing something that you want to do. I got to thinking about, my own weekly rhythms. I come home from work. Well, then there's family responsibilities. We got dinner. There's parenting stuff. There's homework. There's bedtime routine. There's all the business. If I get 1 hour a day to do something that is life-giving for me, that I want to do, I'm feeling pretty good about that. If on the weekend I get maybe a few hours more than I would get on a weekday, and I could get up to about 10 hours a week of something that I want to do, I'm feeling pretty good. And by the way, that's a good thing to do. Like, we need to have some personal self-care time. Like, if all you ever do is put out for everybody in every circumstance, you're going to burn out, you're going to be bitter, frustrated, things aren't going to go well. Like, taking care of ourselves is a good thing. But what if we thought about our investment in ourselves, and let's just say you're able to get 10 hours of personal time a week. If you can get more than that, good for you. And what if we tithed on that investment of our time and our talent by serving others? Well, what if you showed up this morning, and some of you did, you showed up to greet, you got here a little bit earlier to be a welcoming face for someone coming in, you do that once a week, that's getting pretty close to an hour a week. Good for you. If you show up at Awana tonight to do volunteering in kids ministry, or you show up to help do Bread of Life, or pack some meals for Feed the Hunger, or volunteer with some of our partnerships like Community Pregnancy Center, and you're in this rhythm of budgeting about an hour a week for serving others, I'd say that's a pretty good investment. And that 10% principle is going to transform our lives. And then I'd say the same thing about our income, our resources that we have. And this is the direct principle from the Old Testament. When we tithe on our income, what we're doing is actively depending on God. Like, you might say, I don't have a whole lot of margin right now. Things are tight. But when we give, what we're saying is, all right, I'm depending on you, God, to come through. And the promise God makes consistently in the Old Testament and in the New Testament? Just watch how I come through. The principle of the tithe is that 10% transforms 100%. And I think it applies, and I think it's a pretty good budget model for how we spend our time, learning from Jesus, how we spend our talents, serving others, and how we spend our treasure, how we're depending on God. So how do we set a budget? I think that's a pretty good start. Now, if you have a better idea, you don't have to follow my plan. I mean, that's not like Anson chapter 1, verse 1. I'm not in the Bible like that. So if you don't like my plan, great. Come up with a better one. But the question is, what's it going to take for you? Like, what's the investment that's going to keep you invested so that you don't start something that you don't finish? So create a budget. After we create a budget, next very, very practical thing we do is make a calendar. Like, all right, here's how much time, talent, and treasure we're going to invest. Now, when am I going to do it? And we all know, like, if it doesn't land on the calendar, it probably isn't going to happen. So the challenge is, let's get on a calendar and go, all right, when am I going to learn from Jesus? When am I going to serve others? And how much are we going to give? And where's it going to go this week, this month? Make a calendar. We use this, I call it the discipleship wheel around our church. And it's the 7 practices that we can actually put on the calendar. Worship services, groups, serving teams. Those are things that we show up for, right? And invest time learning and serving. The bottom 4, prayer, work, rest, relationships, are things that we grow up in, that we individually schedule on the calendar. When am I going to read my Bible? When am I going to pray? Instead of waiting to get around to it sometime when I feel like it, how about I put it on the calendar to give myself a much better chance of actually doing these things? So create a budget. How much time are we going to invest? And when am I going to do it? Make a calendar. And then the third piece, and this is really where the rubber meets the road, is the follow through, right? We create a budget, we make a calendar, but then when the time comes, we have to actually do it. One podcaster I listen to a lot talks about pre-deciding what we're going to do, and then when the time comes, don't re-decide. Like, I'm good at that, right? I'll pre-decide, but then when the time comes, it's like, nah, maybe I'll do something else. Someone slide it down to the next box in the calendar. That's probably a better time to do it anyway. That's bad. Don't do that. Like, pre-decide, I'm preaching to myself right now. You pre-decide, put it on the calendar, and then don't re-decide. Follow through, do it. Which leads to our daily drill. This doesn't mean we're done, by the way. I got 2 more things to give you, but I'm dropping the drill into the middle of the sermon this week. Sorry for some of those that you were like, wow, he's done already. Not yet. Daily drill, number 6, here it is. Put 1 practice on the calendar for every day this week and do it. 1 practice on the calendar every day this week and do it. Now, don't don't swing for the fences or shoot for the stars on this. If this is new for you, don't plan like, I'm going to pray for 3 hours Wednesday morning. I'm getting up at 4 a.m. I usually don't roll out of bed till 9:45, but I'm getting up at 4 and I'm praying. You won't, don't do it. Don't put that on the calendar. But if you go, all right, I'm gonna actually commit to 5 minutes of reading the Bible while I'm sipping my coffee, and I'm gonna pray for another 5 minutes on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. All right, well, that's something you might be able to do, right? It might be, hey, I've been hearing about serving. I know I need to find my place. All right, this afternoon, I'm going to get online. I'm going to fill out the form that says, all right, I'm interested in serving here. Or I'm going to reach out to Tucker. Or I'm going to do something to take that step. Stick it on the calendar, and when the time comes, do it. Maybe you need to get out your actual budget. You go, all right, what are we going to give this month? What are we going to give this year? Put it on the calendar, make a decision, and start to do it. Could be very different, something different every day. But my challenge is for all of us, do something to learn from Jesus, to serve others, to depend on God. Stick it on the calendar, 1 thing a week, make it manageable, and then do it. Because Jesus says the last thing we want to do is start building the tower and then quit when it's only halfway built. So before you start following Jesus, plan for the cost to finish, to stick with it for a lifetime. Third thing. That was before you start following Jesus, so it's sort of aimed at those of us who are inclined to follow Jesus. This next one, I think, is aimed at those of us who are not so inclined to follow Jesus. Maybe we're pushing back on this a little bit. I think the call to plan for us is, before you oppose Jesus, plan a strategy for making peace with him. Before you oppose him, stop, consider your plan, and make a strategy for how you're going to make peace with Jesus. So he tells another story. He says, suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he's not able, he will send a delegation while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. So here Jesus talks about kings making peace with other kings. And he's actually recalling, once again, something that is laid down way early in God's relationship with people. So when God called out Abraham and made a covenant with him, a promise with him, he did so in the way that kings made peace treaties with other kings. So way back in the ancient times, in the Abrahamic times, if you had a powerful king and a powerful kingdom and they came up against, a smaller, weaker king and kingdom, then what would happen is that stronger one would say, hey, clearly I could take you down and we could obliterate you, but here's some terms of peace. Like if you don't want us to wipe you off the map, then we'll take you in, and as long as you obey my rules, as long as you're loyal to me, then here are the blessings that I'm going to give you, and here are the consequences if you don't. This is just how it worked. So if you were a smaller kingdom, a weaker king, and that stronger king was coming up, you had really, one of two choices. You could fight him, and then that was, doomsday for you and your people, or you could ask for terms of peace, and now you're living in this larger kingdom. Now, that didn't always work out so bad. Like if this was a good king and a good kingdom, and your stock probably just rose. If I'm a citizen of that smaller kingdom, and now I've got everything that this larger kingdom has to provide, pretty sweet deal. And that's exactly what God offered to Abraham. He said, hey, this is what it's going to look like to be a part of my kingdom. And you obey me, you're loyal to me, and the blessings are going to flow. If you don't, there are consequences. But what God did for Abraham, while it was similar to the typical peace treaties between kings, it was actually unique in one spectacular way. And it's the reason we sing worship songs all the time. Because God knew that Abraham and his children would not be loyal to God always. They would not always obey him and follow after the rules. But instead of Abraham and his people paying the consequences of death for that, God said, I'm going to actually bear it for you because I know you can't keep up with all my rules. I know you're not good enough to meet my standard, but I am going to lay down my own life to pay the price for you so that you can be in my kingdom forever. And that's what he did in Jesus. He upheld both sides of that peace treaty. We see this beautiful ceremony in Genesis chapter 15 where God is sort of making this solemn promise to Abraham. This is the law that God gave through Moses. He said, here are the blessings for obedience. Here are the curses for disobedience. But I'm going to keep on paying that price to help you stay in my kingdom, to offer forgiveness. It's where the sacrificial system came from. It's where the concept of Jesus making that payment for you and me came from. But this is what Jesus is saying. Jesus is the stronger king. And when we come to him, like a weaker king, we're laying down everything that we can do for ourselves and for our kingdom. But when we make peace with him, we're receiving everything that he can do for us in his kingdom when we're a part of it. And that is a great deal. So when he says, if we don't give up everything that we have, we cannot be his disciple, that's not loss. That's gain. Because what he does for his kingdom is a whole lot better than what you and I can do for ours. That's why Jesus said, whoever wants to save their life by opposing me, like, I want it myself, I want it myself, I want it myself. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will save it. So before you oppose Jesus, stop and consider your strategy for making peace with him. And then lastly, if you make a plan and stick to it, you will be the salt of the earth. So we're talking about planning. We're talking about budgeting, calendaring, following through. We're talking about making peace with Jesus, allowing his kingdom to take us in so that we receive all of the blessings that he wants to bring us. And if we make that plan and we stick to it, then Jesus closes out this section with a pretty cool statement. You're going to be the salt of the earth. Luke 14, 34 and 35. He says, salt is good, but if it loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure pile. It is thrown out. Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. So in the previous two stories, the builder and the king were the ones that are supposed to make a plan, take action. But here the story flips a little bit. It's what God is going to do in response to our planning and our action. And I believe what Jesus is saying is planning well and following through is what keeps us salty. And that's another way of saying it's what keeps us in it for the long haul. So what does it mean for a person to be salty? Well, I'll tell you, it's not what we usually mean when we say salty in our day. Like when we talk about someone getting salty, it's like my kid's realizing in the middle of Dad's painting project, he's pretty salty right now because the paint sprayer oversprayed onto an area that he already sprayed. Now he's going to go back and redo it. And Dad's been salty for a couple of days over that one. Like, that's not what we mean. Like, Jesus isn't saying go, be, overly frustrated and irritable over petty things. Like, that's not what salty is. So what is salt in this context? And what does it mean for us to be the salt of the earth? Well, what was salt good for? Back then and today, salt is good as a preservative. That's why we have country ham. Because back in the day, really, really salty ham was better than rotten ham if you didn't have a refrigerator. Salt is a preservative. It keeps things from rotting, from spoiling. Salt is a fertilizer. At least back in the day, this is one of their ways to fertilize. It would kill the weeds off the top and add nutrients to the soil. But if that salt got ruined, like you left it out in the rain and the water dissolved the salt and then it evaporated and all that was left was sort of the contaminants, well, then that would just kill everything on the ground. They would throw that on the ground to make sure it didn't grow back. But when salt was salty, it was a good fertilizer in the day. And then, of course, then and now, salt just made things taste better. Salt is a seasoning. And so salt is good in all these ways. And it was so valuable back in the day that it was actually used to barter and trade and actually pay wages sometimes. So like you did a good job, I'd pay you some salt. That's where we get that phrase. Like a good worker is somebody who's worth their salt. It's like what they would get paid. And so this concept of salt was really meaningful in this agricultural setting. And Jesus knew this, and this is what he's saying to his disciples. He says, salt is good for all these things. You want to be salty. But if you lose your saltiness, like if you start but don't finish, you can't keep building that tower, you won't make peace with me, then it loses its saltiness, and that's just no good for anybody. He says it's no good for the soil. It's just going to kill everything. It's no good for the manure pile. Now this one is pretty funny. I didn't know this. Maybe you knew this. They would use dried manure, dried poop, to cook back in the day. I know, weird, right? And what they would do with salt is they would pour salt all over the cooking surface because it would raise the burn temperature of the dried dung that they used to cook with. Pretty gross, I know, but this is like practical for them for their cooking. So when Jesus says, hey, it's no good even for the manure, he means that salt has been worn out because you could only use it so many times and then it lost its saltiness and then you got to get some new salt and the old salt just gets thrown off. It's no good for the soil. It's no good for the manure. Jesus is saying, stay salty. And in Matthew chapter 5, when he's giving this similar teaching, he says it outright. He says, you are the salt of the earth. You're here to preserve the world around you. And I think that's a pretty cool call. Like when we're salty, when we're not living to be popular, when we're not living to be great for ourselves, when we're not living for success at all costs, when we're not afraid of suffering for a good purpose, and we show that there's life on the other side of it, then we're salty. When we carry our cross, we're salty. And Jesus says that's a preservative for the little part of the world that we live in. Like, you could help preserve the world around you from getting rotten. Like, you're on a work team. You're on a student team. You got a circle around you. And sometimes, things tend to go south, right? Like, the conversation goes, or people start doing, all sorts of things. And you could have the opportunity, because you're salty, to actually keep things from going rotten. Salt is a preservative. We can have that influence in the world that we live in. It's a fertilizer. We can actually nourish and invest in the people around us. It's a seasoning. Like, we can just make things better by the way that we live our lives, by the way that we follow Jesus. When we carry our cross, when we follow Jesus, when we've got a plan and we're working the plan, that's what keeps us salty. That's what keeps us following Jesus. And this is how he can change the world literally through you and me. It's the call to plan. And we do it when we take up our cross, because Jesus took up his first. And that's what we remember when we celebrate communion every month. We remember what Jesus has done for us so that we might make peace with him as his followers, and that we can do it for life. So we're going to celebrate communion together. I'd invite our deacons to go ahead and make your way forward. If you're new around here, the table is open. Don't have to be a member or a regular attender here to participate in communion with us. But we do ask that you be a follower of Jesus. Like, you're in. You're not perfect, but you're making your best effort to follow after Jesus. And if that's not you, just let it pass. There's no judgment on you whatsoever. When the plate comes around, take both the cups out. The top is the juice, the bottom is the wafer. All the wafers are gluten-free, and we take them together when I lead us in just a moment. And let's use this time together to think about that question. What's it going to take? How much time, talent, treasure will it take for you to follow Jesus for the long haul, to serve others, learn from him, depend on God? Have that conversation with God in the few moments that we have while the elements are being passed, and then we'll take them together, remembering what Jesus has done for us. Would you join me in prayer? Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of Jesus. Not only his teaching and his example, but his life, his blood, his body that was shed for us so that we might be forgiven and find peace with you in your kingdom. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that gift. Meet with us in these moments. Help us to make some practical decisions, some new plans that will keep us following you in 2026 and for a lifetime. And thank you for